Sustain267.
Welcome to the Sustain267 Podcast, where we host conversations on different issues affecting climate change in Botswana and the rest of Africa. I am your host, Babusi. This episode of Sustain267 Podcast is a recording from the Botswana's Road to COP26 webinar that we hosted in partnership with the British High Commission in Botswana. We had a conversation about what COP26 means for Botswana just 2 days before it was to begin in Glasgow. To kick off the conversation, we had an opening message from Sean Price, the High Commissioner and UK Special Representative to SADC. Sean?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Pato. I'm really pleased to be here this morning. Momentum is really building towards COP26 in Glasgow now. It's going to start on Sunday at the World Leaders Summit, and conversations like this one are happening right now all around the world, and it's very important that they do. If we're going to meet the Paris Agreement goals, we must decarbonise the global economy 3 to 5 times faster over the coming decade than we have over the last 2 decades. And we need to achieve a similar step change in building resilience. And we need to look at how we do this together as a global community with stronger national and local action and stronger international collaboration focused on the practical challenges we share. We can't achieve any of this unless we work together. COP26 is a very important moment in encouraging this global momentum. And it's the first significant test of the Paris Agreement, where countries will reassess their national mitigation commitments. You've probably heard them talked about here in Botswana as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, against the overall temperature goals set in Paris. And it'll also be a day of reckoning on the progress of the other pillars of the Paris Agreement on adaptation and finance. So the UK has 4 core goals for COP. Mitigation. We need to secure global net zero and keep 1.5 degrees within reach through submission by every country of ambitious 2030 emissions reductions targets and long-term strategies marking a way out of the pathway to net zero. Adaptation. We need to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats from the destructive impacts of climate change, ensuring that vulnerable communities are supported to develop and implement credible strategies to access adaptation finance, and to make progress towards the global goal for adaptation. And finance. We need to mobilise finance, with developed countries delivering on their commitment to mobilise $100 billion in climate finance per year, and then all countries acting to redirect those finance flows, including mobilising trillions of dollars from the private sector. And collaboration, the most important of all in my mind. We need to collaborate across governments, across business, across civil society to finalise the Paris rulebook and make real progress in the largest emitting sectors of power, road transport and land use. That's the only way we're going to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. But we can only achieve these goals if everyone plays their part. The global appetite for climate action has never been bigger, and discussions like this one play a vital role in harnessing that appetite to drive forward real-world action and ensure that everyone's voices are heard. So I'm very grateful to Pato for convening us here today, and I'm sure we're going to have a fruitful debate.
Thank you for that opening message, Sean. Everyone should do their part and all voices should be heard. And today's episode is dedicated to contributing to just that by sharing knowledge and encouraging action. In respecting that, not everyone who was a part of the webinar or listening to this podcast necessarily knows what COP is. I'll just do a quick rundown on that. What is COP? COP stands for Conference of Parties. It's essentially the world's biggest climate change conference and the peak decision-making body for global climate change commitments. COP makes progress towards the UNFCCC, which is an agreement between 197 countries to limit greenhouse gas concentrations. COP is held annually with the exception of 2020, which was due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and this year COP will take place in Glasgow, Scotland from the 31st of October to the 12th November 2021, and it is being hosted by the United Kingdom in partnership with Italy. So, COP is important because under the 2015 Paris Agreement, each country agreed to submit national plans known as the Nationally Determined Contributions, which explain their targets and efforts to reduce emissions. New NDCs must be submitted every 5 years to reflect the highest possible ambition. And COP26 marks the first 5-year mark since the Paris Agreement in 2015. This is a crucial moment for countries to review and update their NDCs. More broadly, global emissions must plummet this decade if we are to avoid catastrophic climate impact. If world leaders don't commit to bold steps now under all the international pressure on Glasgow, it's even more unlikely that they will take concrete action afterwards. This is why COP26 has been hailed as the world's best last chance to get the climate emergency under control. The stakes have never been higher. The COP26 goals are 1. Mitigation, to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. 2. Adaptation, to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. 3. Finance, to mobilize finance. Developed countries previously committed to provide $100 billion of climate financing annually to help developing countries tackle the climate crisis. They have fallen short of the agreement, and COP26 will be a big moment to upload and strengthen the pledge. 4. Collaboration, to work together to deliver significant sections of the Paris rulebook remain unfinished after several years. These are the rules that make the Paris Agreement operational, and COP26 aims to finalize these. For more information, you can visit the COP26 official website, and we will share that link in the show notes. Now on to our conversation on Botswana's road to COP26. Joining us is Tremayne Stanton-Kennedy, who is the Resilience and Green Growth Advisor and Regional Climate Lead for Southern Africa at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We also have Mrs. Baitshepi Babusi Hill, Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Environment, Natural Resource Conservation and Tourism in Botswana. And lastly, we have Dr. David Lesolle, a climatologist and lecturer at the University of Botswana and one of my former lecturers. To kick off the conversation, my first question was, what is the significance and importance of COP26 to Botswana and the Southern African region?
Thanks, Pato, and very happy to be here with you today. So what we really have to keep in mind, there are two reasons this COP is a game changer. The first is it is one of the 5 yearly check-in points on nationally determined contribution plans. So in 2015 and onwards, countries started submitting their NDCs to the UNFCCC. This year is the year that we update them. This is the year we get the good numbers on where we stand on warming of the planet. So that's really critical. The second reason it really matters is momentum in those economies which have historically contributed the most to climate change. We are seeing for the first time governments step up and say, no, we're hearing what people around the world are saying, we're hearing what our youth are saying, we are going to put ourselves on pathways to net zero, we are going to make sure that our impact overseas is not exacerbating the environment or climate change. And I think that's an incredible step change from previous COPs. And for me, really something I'm going to keep my eye on as we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Tremayne. Lesolle?
Perhaps the most important thing is, let's go back to the history of it. About 1992, we agreed that there's a problem. That was at the Earth Summit in Rio. And in principle, we agreed to work together. That is why it is important that we are all in it together. And we agreed that we only have one Earth. There's no alternative, place for us to live as a species. Then we agreed to come up with, policies. So we came up, we developed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in the Framework Convention, all we did was we agreed that there is a problem with climate and that climate is changing and it is changing too fast. Climate has always changed, as you know, Pato, but this time the concern is it is changing so fast that we run the risk of not adapting and coping with the change. So what did we do? We said, we also agreed that we should set up other institutional forums. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to set the scientific sort of conversation. We called it intergovernmental and not international because the thinking is that all government, all people must participate in the science and agree on the science. So, for example, therefore, the membership of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's by all countries, all experts. In Botswana, we have members who are participating in that IPCC. One of the robust findings from the IPCC is that, yes, indeed, human developmental agenda has contributed to the increased concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So, historically, therefore, all we have done as we developed is to put into the atmosphere billions and billions of tons of greenhouse gases, all the smoke that comes from our development. This is from our power stations, from our transport sector, from our agricultural sector, you name it, from all of our developmental activities. But then we also agreed, who's going to take part? Well, who's going to do what? So we came up with the Kyoto Protocol. And in the Kyoto Protocol, we agreed that developed countries must take lead. So we agreed in Kyoto in 1997, and nothing has been happening ever since. There's been a bit of movement, but not too much. Now we are at the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, like you said at your intro. And it is now obvious that we are risking us going into a crisis mode where we are worried that we might be at a point of no return. And therefore, it is important for us in Africa that as we go to COP, we must ask all partners to take it seriously, to consider livelihoods that are at stake, and to consider the developmental agenda that we must take on as the alternative moving forward. But it is important that we must understand that we're not talking about the emissions of today. We're talking about historical emissions. Once we understand that, then the proportional responsibility is very important. And that is why the developed countries like Botswana, like African countries, are asking the development the partners, the other parties, negotiating parties, that, please let us accept the historical responsibility and accept that there are impacts already and accept that something must be done. And then we should also, therefore, talk about the amount of money and the resources that will be needed. Some of it is not necessarily money. Some of it is the technological exchanges that we need to put in place. So there's a number of things that, and I hope we can talk about those in the next round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that rundown over the years and the history of COP. I see Mayor Babusi Hill has joined us. Thank you so much for joining us. We were just looking at the history of COP and its significance to Botswana and the Southern African region. But I think, seeing as you are at COP, you can maybe speak to what is the significance of this individual COP to Botswana as part of the delegation.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I am here in Glasgow today to be attending our COP, which Botswana finds herself very proud to have been able to come here all the way from Botswana. Right now, we are here because we are part of the whole universe, which complies and party to the Convention of Climate Change, as it's now called. And the significance of this conference to Botswana is that we are party to it. So we've also been contributing to the establishment of the convention, and we are also, as Botswana, contributing to climate change effects. For instance, a little bit that we are doing in the country that people do not necessarily know that they are participating, they should take pride in that. We are at the moment saying that, bringing us to this COP, saying that we have taken part in ensuring that the emissions that we are talking about, that the world is talking about, to be reduced across the world. We are participating in that. We have decided as Botswana to reduce, to put a pledge for ourselves to say that we will be able to, looking at our infrastructure and our ability and all the things around us, to be able to reduce our emissions by 15%. And that is the pledge that we are bringing along to this COP. And how we're going to do it is that we are going to take the whole of Botswana, private sector, government, institutions of higher learning, including the university, to be able to be a part of the reduction process. Everyone in Botswana is going to be part of the reduction process. How we're going to do it, we're going to make sure that we educate Botswana. We are going to make sure that we educate everyone who is responsible for releasing gas emissions into the environment. That is number one. Number two, we are part of the global environment facility. We are also all involved in a way as Botswana, because we are going to ensure that as Botswana, we comply with the negotiations that have been put in front of us. For instance, there has been some agreements with time, starting with the very first COP that has started. Botswana has been complying with such agreement. The one important agreement that is in place at the moment is what is called the Paris Agreement, where every country is saying we are going to pledge the 15%. We are going to ensure that we reduce the temperature. We are going to ensure that we maintain the temperature increase across the world, not in excess of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we are seeing all the initiatives that we are bringing in to ensure that it happens. The other thing is that as Botswana, we are mainly producing our energy system, our energy like electricity and gas. We are using our coal. That is not because we want to be in that other side of the coin where we are contributing to the gas emission using coal. We are simply saying we want to bring in technologies that would be able to say we are producing this energy safely and in a manner that will not pollute the environment. We want to bring those technologies in. That is why we are here to meet developed countries who have also pledged during the Paris Agreement and other agreements that follow that they will assist developing countries to make sure that they are part of this emission. The developed countries have pledged in terms of financing and funding to ensure that we have enough money as a country to be able to bring in these technologies. Other countries like Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom have got the technologies. What is left is that they can be able to pledge those during this meeting. We are going to make sure that during our negotiations, we plead with them to assist developing countries which are also landlocked like Botswana to be able to overcome such issues. We also have side meetings where the Honorable Minister will be able to meet different parties to be able to negotiate further and see how they can first improve our collaboration in terms of seeing ourselves in power with developing countries and other least developing countries so that we can have one voice. We also have what is going on in the agenda, which is called the Africa Group. The Africa Group is where all the African nations are here as we speak in a meeting, trying to come up with one voice to be able to say, the first world and the developing world, let's come together and see how Africa can be helped to come up and make sure that we acclimatize and we are also able to adapt to all the effects of climate change. The most insignificant being the funding sources that we need. I've got quite a lot to say, but we are here to make sure that when we go back to Botswana, we are carrying with us something that came out of these meetings that we are attending right now. We are, as we speak, in a meeting called the Africa Group of negotiators, where the African group will come with one solid agreement. And then from there, we're going to be meeting again with the G77, which are other developing countries, where would be able to voice. Botswana will always appear there. If you can see me, this is what takes me into the conference to ensure that Botswana voice is heard. We are here so that Botswana can be heard. So wherever you are, and this is becoming so important to us to be able to participate even at home in a webinar of this kind to ensure that our country knows that we are here for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babusi, for talking us through what you've taken there, what you're hoping to get, whole process of what goes on the ground. I think a lot of us do know that there's this big meeting, but we don't quite know what happens in the corners and the like. Like you were just saying, you are part of our delegation, but I'm curious to know what our position is and what's on our agenda. But before we get there, Lesolle, you contributed to the climate response policy that was approved in Parliament earlier this year. And in light of the policy that was approved, what should we be prioritizing for COP26? Lesolle, looking at the policy, what should our priorities be?
Well, I think the policy is a very good document. At least what it says is, Botswana is committed to reducing emissions. But then the policy also says we're going to need assistance, like Babusi Hill said. And it sets out the aspirations and the things that we should do. First of all, like Babusi Hill said, we recognize that we're a carbon-intensive economy. And we do also recognize, Hori, we have abundance of a natural resource called the sun. But the technology, as you and I know, Pato, is still far lacking in terms of solar. We're hoping with all the partnerships that we're having with the US government, with the other partners, we will be able to develop and become a center of excellence insofar as renewable energies are concerned. It's not just about technology dumping, it's about technology transfers. So our policy is saying it must be equitable, it must be distributive, and everybody should take part in this. It also recognizes another important sector, the transport sector. So the energy sector, remember you're talking about all of the generation, and all of the other sectors. But the transport sector is where we need to do a bit of work. And the policy is setting out key guidance and principles. Remember, the strategies have still to be developed, but the policy is there. It is saying to the whole world as Botswana, we are very committed to reducing the emissions, and we do recognize that climate change is going to impact on our tourism, on our agriculture, on our water, and it's already impacting on some of these key sectors. And therefore, we need to balance not just on mitigation and reducing the emissions, but also create a balance and make sure that we are addressing the impacts and coping strategies for climate change and global warming. In a nutshell, I think that's what. Of course, I'm sure Mama Babusi here will add a bit more onto those comments. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Lesolle. Ms. Tremayne, what should our position as Southern Africa be? You work across the region. What should our consolidated position as we go to COP26 as a specialist yourself be?
Well, I always feel a bit badly reflecting on what other countries' positions ought to be. However, SADC has developed a common position which is very much focused on the mechanics of COP. And by that, it's useful to remember that the Conference of Parties is a UN process. It's not all countries coming together themselves, it's all countries coming together as parties to a UN process. So SADC has a common position that they're putting forward, which is very much speaking to the need for energy transitions, respecting the impacts on livelihoods and the environment and how to mitigate but also adapt to those. So it looks at responsibilities of the region, but also that ongoing requirement for support from developed economies. I think if I was to reflect on Botswana itself, it's undeniable the impacts that a changing climate will have. It's predominantly a desert country. I think it's something like 3/4 is covered by the Kalahari Desert. So I think Botswana should first and foremost go and ask what new technology is out there to help us, what new offers are being put on the table. And a lot of those will be announced at COP, which is promising. And as part of that, a lot of these will be about the investment environment. So there's so much that can be done at home, and I say this for every single country in the region, to make investment easier, to work on that enabling environment to ensure it's more efficient, more transparent. And if you make it easier and reliable and trustworthy, money will come. And I obviously am saying that with my green growth hat, so I'm more interested in an enabling environment for environmentally sensitive investments. I also think for Botswana, it's important to get an NDC in. Now, my data might be slightly out of touch, but if you go on the UNFCCC website, the only NDC for Botswana still dates to 2015. And my understanding is the country is working on a new one, which is due for this COP. However, whether or not the ambition within that document is commensurate to what is possible, I think is potentially up for discussion. So if we look at some of the data for the region, and my region is slightly different to SADC in that I don't cover DRC and Tanzania as well, so the numbers will be a bit different as a result. But South Africa accounts for about 46% of all emissions in the region, which is quite significant considering that's up against 10 or so other countries. Botswana is the 6th highest emitter in the region, and it's more or less twice of what Namibia emits. So it may not be the biggest on the world stage if you're looking at the G20, but it's not insignificant for Southern Africa. And at COP, a lot of the talk will be around the challenges in the G20. So the dependency on coal, the dependency on dirty fuel, the rapidly urbanizing environments and large populations. Think about China, think about India, you're thinking about South Africa when you're talking about the G20 or Brazil. But Botswana also has a constrained environment. So if you look at the different sectors that are contributing to Botswana's emissions, and my data is from 2018 because there's a bit of a lag getting through the reliable stuff in the system. Actually, the majority, something like 70% of the emissions from Botswana are due to land use change and forest management. So how you manage nature and soil and urbanization is going to be fundamental to how Botswana tackles its emissions profile. And I think those conversations, having those at COP, going to the pavilions where there might be organizations or experts or events where they're talking about how can you manage your land to reduce your emissions impact, I think those also should be really high on the agenda for Bots, because it's very much similar in its profile mix to Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. And when you start thinking about where your greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, then that changes how you think about how you tackle them. But that's not to say energy isn't something that needs to be addressed urgently, because that has been growing as part of the emissions profile since 2010. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Tremayne. We'll be circling back to the NDCs in the next question, but for the entrepreneurs on the call, I did see some of the people who registered in business in this area, enabling investment environment. money willing to come here. Let's prepare for it. And then just before we go into depth on the NDCs, Mayor Babusi Hill, what is our main position as we go to at COP26? And what are the three main items on our agenda, respective of the COP26 goals being global net zero, mobilizing finance, and collaboration?
Thank you very much. There has been, before I go to that, there has been a question within the panels. They were asking about what we are doing to help Botswana. I'll start with the issues of policy. We have a policy that the Lesolle had talked about. That policy, the climate change policy, is available and is accessible for everyone. We have it as hard copy and soft copy, where everyone can be able to pick one. So we are one of the implementing ways of that policy is that we are going to be starting with the communities, everyone who is involved in Botswana, to be able to make them, to train them, or sort of capacity building, because some of the items in the climate change program is about capacity building, ensuring that everybody is brought on board, including the technocrats, including those who are at home, everybody who is involved. So we'll ensure that everybody is part of the policy. One of the biggest issues that the policy brings forward is to create employment as well for people in Botswana, besides just talking about curbing emissions and the like. So we're talking about ensuring that there is employment created to ensure that Botswana have access to those jobs. How we are going to do it, we will find a way as a country to make sure that Botswana have access to that. The policy also talks about issues of bringing in some of those enablers to make sure that we bring down the emissions, like the last speaker was talking about us being the sixth and the highest in the region. So we want to bring in those enablers. One of them is ensuring that we bring levies or taxes that will be able to take care of the issues of unnecessary emissions and reduction in general reduction in gas emissions across the board. So for the Botswana's position, you asked about the three main issues that we want. We are talking about ensuring that our policies are incorporated in the climate change across in the country. So that's what we are bringing in to the COP. We are also bringing in issues of our nationally determined contributor, the NDC, that is ambitious enough to our understanding to be able to meet our infrastructure and our ability to implement it as Botswana, which also comes with the monitoring and evaluation of it, the MRVs, that as they call them in the modern language. So our NDC is out, and it has just been passed by our Interministerial Committee on Treaties and Protocols in Botswana last week, which means that it is now an official document which we will start sharing immediately during the COP and after. So the other thing that we want to see as Botswana, we want to see commitment from developed countries, providing funding to enable developing countries like Botswana to be able to implement climate change measures. So we want to see that happening. We also would like to see conclusion to market and non-market mechanism and conclusion to the tools that enable implementation of the Paris Agreement rule book. We want to see all the agreements that are in the rule book of following the Paris Agreement to be marketable, to be put on the table and say this can this include issues of being able to say we have carbon credits as Botswana. For instance, a simple example that can take place is that we have been working with the Australians to control fires around the country, and such projects we already are working with Total, a French company which wants to start buying our credits. If we can work towards that and be able to make it, we'll be saying that we have made it as Botswana. And lastly, I talked about our national determined contributors, which is the NDC, which we are saying we want to reduce our gas emissions by 15% by 2030 relative to the business as usual scenario. The baseline scenario does not include land use change and forestry, which constitute a net sink of Botswana. However, the mitigation actions include the land use sector where increased retention of the gas are counted towards the achievement of the target. So we talked about earlier on about land management and the like. All the ministries, this is an interministerial and all the private sector who are part of this are included. So we want to see ourselves being able to work together to ensure that we work towards this ambitious target of 15%. So our NDC review identified a major constraints to implementation to both adaptation and mitigation measures as noted across all sectors. And then there's also a lack of capacity that we intend to start working on as Botswana.
Thank you, Mayor Babusi Hill. That's quite news to me that we'll be starting to sell credits to a French company. We went into depth quite a bit there on NDCs. If I'm getting you right, please confirm for me, Mayor Babusi Hill, we will be getting our revised NDCs within the next, you said at Glasgow, so that's within the next 2 weeks. So within 2 weeks, we'll have the revised NDCs. And then just in case anyone is not up to speed, our current NDC is that we shall reduce our overall emissions by 15% by 2030, taking 2010 as the base year.
That's very true that our NDC report is ready. We were just waiting to put up the logo because somebody was doing it who is supposed to put their logo in, assisting us. Like I said, it's ready and it has been passed by our government institution that deals with treaties and protocols. So we are ready and we are saying we will make it available immediately after the COP. And right now, if I was in Botswana, I would say here it is, because this is where we are going to present it. We're going to submit it to the UNFCCC today. No, I mean this week, sorry, when the COP starts.
I'm definitely looking forward to that. And then also possibly a conversation on the NDCs, how they were put together and the like once it is out. But that's a conversation for another day. As we draw to a close on my session with the panelists, a direct question. Just one thing, what are your desired results from COP26? So something practical, something tangible. What would you like to see from COP26, Babusi Hill, Lesolle, and Ms. Tremayne? We shall start with Lesolle.
Hi, Pato. Yeah,
hello.
At COP26, there's been a bit of money in the GCF. It hasn't been 100 billion like the developed countries had pledged. So we want to see them live their pledge. But on top of that, and given that we have Botswana's priorities, I would like to see Botswana, companies, private sector, civil society, draw down on this money. I'm not seeing a lot of activity. I'm therefore encouraging us that instead of pointing a finger there at COP26, let's try and point a finger at ourselves and say, are we ready? And what institutional reforms do we need to put in place to make sure that once the money is there, and it is already there, but we're not using it. I don't see it's the amount of money trickling down into Botswana. It is very small compared to, say, the Namibians and the other people around us. And University of Botswana, if I may say, has applied to be what is called an NIE. And we're not getting the support. We would really like to see the support to see this application go forward. And whatever happens, let's drum up and say, let's get the money to Botswana. Let's put in the institutions to do the adaptation projects, the coping projects on all sorts of issues. But then the other thing is, the biodiversity part of the argument and the link to to climate change. It is called the nature-based solutions. It is something that is on the agenda at COP26. Now, remember, most of our livelihoods are nature-based. So whether you are fetching grass, whether you're picking up honey, whether you're weaving baskets, whether you're doing whatever, tourism is nature-based. We need to link the discussion here, climate change, to the nature-based and come up with nature-based solutions. And it is not an easy thing. And unfortunately, it may be addressed through adaptation, but I think what we really need to do is to look for partners. And I'm happy that Babusi Hill is saying they're going to sit on one-on-one with like-minded people and friends to help us. And I'm urging for nature-based solutions to be part and parcel of the discussion, hopefully. And finally, there's an issue on what is called loss and damage. There's a lot of loss that is attributable to climate change and the damage on the infrastructure and everything. And these are at a huge cost to countries like Botswana. I know Botswana is a middle-income country, but if I was to talk from a southern perspective, Mozambique, just one cyclone, Dineo, costed about 7% of the GDP. Now, sometimes we don't put these into the monetary impact, but I think there's a lot of need for us to drum up the support. Otherwise, our infrastructure, our development will not be sustainable. And I'll stop there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesolle. Quite a list there for COP Center. But quickly, before you go, you said University of Botswana is an NIE. What does NIE stand for?
Well, under the Green Climate Fund, under this funding mechanism to implement the climate change problems, in Cancun some time back, we asked that we have 50% of the money set aside for mitigation and 50% of the money set aside for adaptation. So all of this money that we're asking for, we have already decided as a COP, as a treaty, that some of it will go for mitigation, some of it will go for adaptation. And we've also said that as a treaty, that half of the resources allocated for adaptation should go to Africa. Now, for this money to come to Africa, there are several ways it can come to Africa. Either we see international, regional organizations come to Botswana, come to Zambia, come to South Africa, or we have homegrown organizations. So you can imagine that the University of Botswana will be a homegrown center of excellence and implementation center for issues around climate change. So if, an organization in Maung wanted to submit a project proposal, or if there was a need to do training and development of capacities of young people in Botswana to do solar for mitigation, etc., then that training would be undertaken by the university. That center will be there, and it would be like a port through which, and that port would be getting the funding from the GCF and channeling it into Botswana. So we are ready. We've already submitted the due diligence papers. We've gone through all of that. But as the chair of the African group has said, and the chair of the our alliance of small island states have noted, it's like the GCF is not giving the developing countries the support it needs. It is keeping the money, it is not doing what it is supposed to be doing. And I think we need to go back to the COP26 on the floor and put to shame and give further guidance to the GCF so that Botswana, otherwise we will not come out of the vulnerability to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarity, Lesolle. So when you started, you spoke about the funding that's available. Are we ready for it? The 52 attendees that are on the call right now who are looking to take up climate action, are you ready for it? Are you ready to use it for climate action? Tremayne, if you could ask for just one thing from COP, what would it be?
Thanks, Pato. I think, and I say this from a personal standpoint, I think what I want to see come out of this COP is sustained action. And I mean action by every single person, every single government, every single company, everyone that can actually consciously do something differently. And that's important to me because we've moved past the point where we can keep saying this is someone else's fault, they should fix it. It's too late. And you see that in the narrative. And I'm optimistic that everybody is bringing greater ambition to COP, wanting to take action. We need the G20 to take more action. There is no denying not enough progress has been made, but more can be with pressure. And I'm hoping that conversations at COP will raise that. But closer to home, the UK last week announced its net zero strategy, committing to a decarbonisation pathway for net zero by 2050. I want to see that happen. I want our government and the next government, our industry, to make that happen. And that requires each of us to also take changes. So, for example, I'm a vegetarian. That's a much lower energy footprint than other types of diet. And that's a choice I've made. Other colleagues, they've decided to eat less meat or buy things when they're in season. We can each do something, and we each must do something. We have to think bigger. We can't just say, well, it's China's fault. It's not just China's fault. It's no one or person's fault, but we all can take action. And that's what I want to see happen. But the second thing I want to see happen, and I'm sorry, I'm cheating, is I want us to not just talk about COP as something that happens every year. I want us to make sure that our education systems, from when children enter school to adults, I want everyone to understand what climate change is, what it means, but why it's not just about emissions. It's also about protecting the environment. It's about planting the right crops in the right place at the right time. It's about working with neighbors for transboundary resources like the Okavango River. It's so much more than any one thing, which means it's complicated, it's complex. And as a result, you can't just learn everything you need to know in a single session. This has to be woven in to every conversation that we have and how our children learn. And I see that as very important because I can't remember a time when I didn't talk about a changing climate or in the environment in danger through school and then onwards into university. It's always been a part of my life. But when I have conversations with people overseas or even in the UK, I realize I was fortunate. My education helped me understand that I was part of the solution. So I want everyone to realize that they're part of the solution.
Thank you, Tremayne. We definitely need more conversation, and that's what we'll be bringing to you at Sustain267. Conversations on sustainability, climate change, and environment. If you haven't yet, do subscribe to Sustain267 Podcast on your preferred podcast provider, and you can listen to some of the conversations we've already had and the ones that we'll have in future. Babusi Hill.
First of all, thank you very much, Pato. It's been a pleasure for us to be seeing Botswana represented here at COP26. And what I would like to see after this COP is a lot of commitment that have been made through the Paris Agreement and other commitments that developed countries have agreed upon to be implemented. Implementation. That's what I will pray for. And then we also want to see accessibility of these funding sources that we're talking about, like the Green Climate Fund. As Botswana, if I should have mentioned earlier, we are trying to make our own National Development Bank to become an accredited entity so that they qualify to be able to get money for Botswana to implement some of the climate change initiatives. So we're really working hard with NDB to see to it that they qualify. If it was possible, they would be here as well with us, if it was not. And then the other thing that we want to take home is ensuring that we get community involvement. We know that civil societies are quite involved. We want to see community involvement and all the vulnerable groups that are out there. Their projects coming up closer to reality to show us that we are indeed implementing some of these things. And issues of our, the last one is that I want to see us, when we leave this COP, taking home with us diplomatic relations with other countries that are better and improved and working towards ensuring that we meet the same target of saying we want to reduce emissions together. We are in it together. And I would like to see when we get home involving all Botswana that they can contribute one way or the other on issues like transport and the like. So that is from my side.
Thank you, Member Babusi Hill. And I think I speak for a lot of us as Botswana when we say we would also like to work closer with government. We're in it together and we would like to contribute to some of the hard work and important work that you do. I know you have to dash. Thank you so much for making time to join us during your extremely busy schedule in Glasgow. Any last words before you dash?
Yes, my last word is to just thank you to continue with your work of ensuring that people in Botswana know what we are here for, because we are in here for them and we are in it together to ensure that we get funding for them to do their projects. We want to see solar farms in Botswana. We want to see diplomatic relations increase. We want to see policies being incorporated. Like we have the integrated waste management policy, where we want to create more jobs for Botswana, and that's where we want to put them together: the policy on climate change and the policy on integrated waste management policy, and others which are related, to be able to push them together. And thank you very much for giving me this chance. Bye.
Thank you, Member Babusi Hill. Please push for us and win for us there in Glasgow. So now we'll be opening up to Q&A from the floor. If you've got a question, please do ask it. I think some of them have been addressed. Those that haven't been, we shall answer live. With Botswana being a relatively small economy with a small population, what would the cost of a green transition be? Tremayne, would you like to go forward with that? I'm not sure if you can answer specifically to Botswana numbers, but if you're able to answer it, please do go forward. Don't let me throw you under the bus.
Well, if you do, make sure it's an electric bus. You're right that I don't have the numbers, but I'm sure that's something we can always try and pull together through the embassy. I think Botswana is in a position where it's got grid infrastructure, and that infrastructure would benefit from being upgraded simply because there's if you take a regional perspective, I'll take a step back. So I don't know the overall costs is the first answer. The second is Botswana is located in the middle of the region. So everything goes through Botswana. Roads go through Botswana. There's the new road link into Zambia, for example. Rail goes through Botswana. Energy goes through Botswana. And if we are talking about a step change and how to profit from the new green economy, specifically in the energy sector, for example, it's a function of connectivity within electricity grids. And Botswana is a member of the Southern Africa Power Pool, which is a regional structure for trading energy. However, there are existing bottlenecks within the country, which means not as much energy can travel through. So there's a degree of overall infrastructure improvement that has to happen to catalyze improvements for the entire region as well. And this won't be new to the government there, and there are ongoing projects through SADC and others to look at this issue. I think because Botswana is comparatively more able, I'll say, you have a more educated population. You have a population that's fairly concentrated physically, which always makes infrastructure easier to manage and green cities easier to implement. You have amazing natural resources. I mean, if you talk to most people about Botswana, they will think about the national parks. They will think about nature. But I want people to think about Botswana as a net solar exporter, and Botswana can do that. And there will be facilities increasingly coming online over the next 10 years to facilitate that. So while I don't know the exact cost, I know that cost is less from today than it would have been 5-10 years ago. And that's why COP26 will be exciting. We've created enough momentum to bring down those prices. And yeah, I suppose the other thing we haven't really talked about that I just want to shove in there before we finish is water. I think you cannot talk about transitions without discussing water. And water is limited because it is a dry country. You've got amazing river resources, but we know flows are going to decrease. So it's about Botswana also thinking about, okay, we need to be more creative with our water cycling technology and how people use water, and we must ensure that only the best uses of water are happening. So if you're growing crops, are you growing the right crops? Should you be irrigating those particular crops, or could you have a crop that requires less water, or could you irrigate it in a more sustainable fashion? So I really also want to get the water point in there, because I think that will be increasingly noticed over the next decade. Thanks.
Thanks for answering that and sliding that the water comment in there. We have an episode where we're talking to a water specialist, and they did say that there's a good chance that the next big war could be over water. We hope it's false, though. A question from Tiny Healy, directed at Lesolle. Isn't importing secondhand cars from Japan, coupled with no regulation policy for keeping up a vehicle, detrimental to our pledge on reducing emissions? Lesolle, if you could keep it really brief. I think we've got about 15 questions to get through.
Well, I think my personal take on that is, no, it's not. You know, it's all about whether it's a human right to decide what I want to own and drive. Imagine, therefore, what I'm trying to say is, imagine that we didn't allow these cars to come in. How do you then stop Botswana from importing it through Kenya or through DRC or wherever? So I think we have a problem with these cars. Like I said, the energy efficiency of these cars, the emissions from these cars, etc. Now, the next thing is, how can we then turn this problem into jobs, into some economic activity, repairing, fixing? Because remember, in Botswana, cars like fridges and other technologies are considered assets, and they're kept for long. Unlike the other cultures where they keep their cars for 3-4 years and then they dispose of them. Here we keep cars for 20 years. That's why you can go into a lot of African countries like Botswana and still find the old Chevrolet and the old Ford or Daihatsu or whatever. So we need to then turn this problem of imported cars, because the people are they like them. And it will be unfair to say to these people, no, go back to your donkey cart. When the other parts of the world are not doing that. And again, I want to insist on this, that even if the whole of Botswana was to stop emitting, we are only about 0.03 of the global emissions of emissions. So even if we were to stop emitting, as long as the big guys don't stop emitting, there would be no impact on the climate, because we are all sharing there's one resource called the atmosphere. So even if the emissions happen in China, in the US, in India, etc., the impact is global. And I want to stop there.
Thank you, Lesolle. And then one is here, Phemelo Makoba. Interactions such as this ones are always informative and full of hope and understanding. However, my interest is on what we are doing to bring an ordinary Botswana at Mohojo on board regarding climate change and climate education. These are the most affected parts of our community, which unfortunately are not aware of the cause of our forced lifestyle changes. Phemelo, I'm happy to speak to this one, but if any of our panelists would also like to speak to it, please put your hands up. So at Sustain267, the idea behind it was to get the conversation going for those with access. We know that podcasts are not very accessible. You need data, you need a certain type of phone or laptop. But our idea was to start the conversation. This webinar is in partnership with British High Commission, but all our other work is independent. So we would appreciate it if, as Sustain267, we're having this conversation, and then Phemelo, at a certain part of Botswana, you continue the conversation there. Beyond just bringing in government, let's almost treat it like a baton. We share it with you and you take it forward, looking at doing what we can with the little that we do have. And then We'll bring on government a little bit later when they're with us to say how are they pushing this conversation. Lesolle, Ms. Tremayne, would you like to come in?
So how should we be pushing this conversation more broadly with peers, is what you mean?
Beyond the city to the rural areas, beyond the urban areas to, the rural areas.
Sort of like, what's beyond the rural areas? Let's take it to the giraffes. So
well, beyond the urban areas.
It's true. Technology is fantastic for spreading information, whether good information or bad, much, much further. But if you aren't connected because it's expensive or the signal just doesn't exist where you are, it's a challenge. And this is why I think introducing climate change and environmental studies into school curricula is so important, because hopefully all children get to go to school, and you don't need fancy videos to talk about a lot of these things. What you need is just simple language, concepts that resonate with people where they are, and a willingness to make sure it happens. And this is why at COP there is going to be a high-level ministerial event, which is encouraging countries to ensure that they are discussing climate change and environment within their domestic school curricula. And I think also families. I'm imagining Botswana might be slightly similar to countries I've lived in, the region here, where you may live in the city, but a lot of your family, you still have your village, you still have your rural connections. So have those conversations. When you're cooking together, have those conversations about cooking fuel and the impact that has on the environment, and maybe get a more efficient stove if you can support your family that way. Or when you're farming, is it appropriate to be growing that particular crop, or is it too high risk now because of unpredictable rains, because it's getting too hot? Or maybe, because I like to be more solutions oriented, are there new varieties of a crop that you want to try growing somewhere, or traditional varieties of a crop? Is there a better way to manage the land? So I'm obviously taking a very agriculture-focused lens onto rural areas, but I think just because somebody isn't necessarily connected, it doesn't mean those conversations can't happen. And I think radio shows, podcasts could easily be translated into radio shows, for example. I know in Zim, radio is quite popular. So I feel like there are options. We just have to be creative and tailor material to them. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Tremayne. Lesolle?
I agree to some extent, but remember, we've set the house on fire. We destroyed the climate and the climate system. And then we turn around and say to people, oh, see how you do it. And I think, honestly, that's a little unfair. I agree that the people must have a conversation about this. Most of the climate disasters and the impact of, we still don't know what the impacts are going to be. So we are asking those with those capacities to give us that information. And we know that the developed countries have access to that. They have this satellite, they have the remote, they have all the labs and the what have you, the science. And I mean, we're just coming out of the bush, so to speak. So while I can go and tell my grandmother and my sister in the rural area that, there's this thing called climate change and, you need to plant other crops and see how you do it. I think it's unfair. I think what we need is a systematic approach to adaptation. That is, number one, let us make sure that we develop the capacities of these people to adapt, to cope with it. So what does that mean? Roads, infrastructure, etc. Those are huge investments. This little bit of dropping cramps and stuff like that, I don't think it is sustainable, honestly speaking. And it is sad sometimes to see that we are now 30 years and we haven't even made any improvement on this. I would really like us to address what the poor people are facing, instead of saying to them, well, this is climate change and see how you do it. Of course, they are already adapting, because if you can't adapt, you die, period. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lesolle. We had another question on Facebook that spoke to leveraging COP for local conversation. I think it's already being done now, and the last two questions did speak to it. And then back on a more global stage, question from an anonymous attendee, Ms. Stanton-Kennedy. You just said that you hope the G20 do more to fight climate change. Does the recent lobbying by countries like Australia and Saudi Arabia with the IPCC worry you? And I think that's relevant to us because, once again, it proves that Africa will be the worst affected. For every degree that the world goes up, I think Africa goes up, well, sub-Saharan Africa goes up 2 degrees. Ms. Stanton-Kennedy?
Thanks, Pato. I think it's true that we are in a world where politics is intertwined with science. So the science is uncontrovertible at this point. It's politics that we probably face more challenges with, politics and the time lags for behavior change more broadly, because behavior change does take time. And we have to acknowledge that when we're planning what we're doing. I think Australia takes an interesting position, considering the impacts of climate change are undeniable on Australia. As a sovereign state, however, it is within its rights to take its decisions, and its electorate, because it is a democracy, also has a role to say to those they elect, this is what we want you to do. So that's one pathway. Saudi Arabia is a different type of governance system, and I think we have to acknowledge where a lot of their wealth has historically come from will always drive a lot of their interests in the future. But they are diversifying their portfolio. We don't necessarily talk about that very much, but they invest in other types of energy generation. They invest in real estate substantially, amongst other things. So even though they might say one thing on the negotiation stage, negotiations are always slightly different to broader political. But I think we also have to give credit to announce, or they have announced. So I think it's useful for Africa, or at least for the Southern Africa region, to perhaps also have that conversation with other countries and say, we're cognizant that you're not necessarily taking steps in a certain pathway. we know you may be doing this for certain reasons, but the impact is disproportionately on us. So are you recognizing that impact on us? And these are bilateral conversations as much as anything, or conversations between possibly SADC and other countries. But I would also say, as we go around and we point out who is not doing enough, which is important, we also should acknowledge those countries that are doing more and say, good, this is wonderful, this is what we need. Because I find with the COP negotiations, it often becomes a space of great negativity instead of a space of great opportunity and hope.
Thank you for that, Tremayne. Lesolle, would you like to chip in?
Yes, Pato. I think I've always, in my past life, I've always had Botswana as a negotiator. And when we did in my conversations with government at general, is that Botswana is already doing a lot to adapt. I mean, we've invested something like 80 megawatts of solar water heaters already. So, and people are already doing solar. So that we are offsetting at our own cost. And I know we will get a pat on the back. But consider another country which is not doing that. What do? They get a reward. So sometimes we are rewarding the people who are not complying. Now, therefore, Botswana, like Saudi Arabia, yes, we've got coal. Saudi Arabia has oil. We used our coal very efficiently for very efficient development. So even there was a mention that Botswana is number 6 in the emissions. But in fact, if you look at emission per unit of GDP, wow, we are very much more an efficient economy than many other economies elsewhere, including in Africa. In fact, we would be right there at the top. I think we are number 2 after people like Tunisia or something like that. Now, therefore, it depends on what yardstick you're going to choose to use. But yes, our arguments are very similar to what Saudi is saying. Saudi is moving in the right direction. But you see, we're worried as the developing country. And remember, Saudi Arabia is also a member of what I call G77 plus China countries, developing countries bloc. And therefore, when we do negotiate, we are worried about the pledges that never come to fruition. We did this in Paris, we did this in Kyoto, right from Kyoto. That developed countries always pledge. Now that trust that I will do something, I will help you with technology, that never comes to fruition. Only 70% comes to fruition is what we're talking about. The trust in the relationships between the developed countries. But yes, as developing countries, Saudi Arabia included, there's a lot that developing countries are doing already. Like I said, if you can't adapt under climate change, you die. So whether we like it or not, we are forced into adaptation by this problem called climate change.
Thank you for that, Lesolle. Adapt or die. And I think that's a great opening into the very last question that we're going to go into, climate inequality, which was asked by Alan. As we know, when we went into COP26, there was a lot of inequality. There was a lot of talk about certain countries not being able to attend because they couldn't get access to vaccinations, but then vaccinations were only available to certain questions. It's been a huge conversation of inequality, whether we're talking cost, whether we're just talking getting the accreditation to even just be allowed to attend. So Alan's question is, have you heard of any delegates or scientists not being able to attend the COP26 summit. I'm going to narrow that to Botswana and Africa because of the high prices of flights and hotels. And how will this impact the conference? Lesolle and then Tremayne. That will be our last question before we close.
In fact, but leading into COP26, it was the Africa group who said the initial proposal was that we have a virtual COP26. But it was the African group's negotiators' position to say, no, that won't work. Why? Because of the technology. So it might sound like a glorious sort of thing. But then what we saw was, wow, the prices of hotels went from £30 to about £600, and then you had to do the quarantine of so many days. And what happened? It thinned out the developing countries. I hope the developing countries will raise this at COP26, because it is not the first time this is happening where a process ends up disadvantaging the developing countries. It is not the government of the British government that is at fault here. It is the way the economy in UK has responded to it. So the owner of the B&B is just coming out of the COVID-19. He needs to recover some money. He's been longing for money, etc., etc. But then in that way, what then happens is, instead of having 5 delegates from developing countries, you end up having 1 or 2 from each. Okay, maybe Botswana, we are sort of at an advantage because we can send in about 8 people. But there's about 60 agenda items. And according to me, 15 of them are top priority for Botswana, 15 of them. Now, and some of these are held simultaneously in the working groups. So, of course, it means you are thinly spread on the ground, and therefore you are not effective in getting your voice heard. So, yes, indeed, it is something that is worrying. We hope that the future COPs will consider this. What I know, for example, in one other country, I won't mention it by name, but it was a developing country. The host government decided, realizing that the private sector wants to escalate the cost. Even the taxi driver wanted to charge more money to the participants. Realizing all of that, they decided to intervene and make sure that they subsidize the local markets, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that should have happened. I'm only saying it certainly has impacted on the effectiveness of our participation in the negotiations at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesolle, which maybe brings forward as well the argument of, should we look into how to equitably finance the attendance of COP26 for developing countries or global southern countries? But that's a conversation for the next webinar or for the next podcast episode. Tremayne?
Thanks. So one of the reasons I'm speaking with you today is because the UK is the COP presidency designate. That means for the last 2 years, because COP26 was delayed by a year due to COVID, the UK has been working towards COP, and then over the next year towards COP27, which will be hosted in Africa, and therefore we've started calling it Africa's COP. The UK will be the president and moving forward with campaigns and some of the ambitions that underlie COP. So it's an ongoing process. As president, I admit it's not been an easy time to plan a COP. COVID-19, I think we can all agree, has made life complicated on every single level. But the UK government has offered to official delegations and as a reminder, an official delegation comprises the negotiators, government representatives, and any NGO or private sector representatives that a particular government chooses to include in their UNFCCC official delegation. So when we say delegation, we're actually talking about a lot of different people. Now, if you are part of the official delegation, you don't have to pay for a visa to go to COP. You get a free transit pass while you're at COP in Glasgow. There are facilities that we're offering some subsidized rooms through the UNFCCC, but it's true, accommodation has been a significant challenge for COP26, and you're seeing how the private sector is taking advantage of an opportunity which ideally they would not, because COP is for all of us to change and save the world. So that, I think, has been a great frustration, not just for Botswana, but all countries that are going to COP. I'm not aware of any delegates who are part of these official delegations unable to go. The challenge is more that there simply isn't a huge amount of accommodation across that part of Scotland, which is easily connected. So that's where some of the issues that we've been dealing with now and this week and up until COP have been directed. But I think Botswana is actually sending one of the smaller delegations in the region. Others are sending more, and while they flag the cost of accommodation, they are covering it through their budgets. So it's difficult for me to say if this is a more punitive COP to attend than previous COPs, but I do know the UK has made strong effort to try and subsidize as many components of it as possible, which hasn't been the case in COPs hosted elsewhere, partly because COVID hasn't been the issue at those previous COPs, but also recognizing how important it is that we meet and we finally move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tremayne. I'm going to give each panelist 30 seconds to say their goodbyes. Tremayne, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Pato, and thank you for putting up with my great technology today. I thank you so much for convening people, for bringing people together for a conversation, and I genuinely hope that everyone today will be able to continue these conversations within their own groups and just keep sharing the message, keep on with the pressure, and keep on with being solutions oriented and in trying to make the environment around you climate accessible. Let's make it easy to go green.
Awesome. Thank you. Lesolle.
Yes, thanks, Pato. And I must congratulate to Sustain267 group and keep the warm fire burning.
And that brings us to the end of the Botswana's Road to COP26 webinar. We had over 150 people registered for this event, which clearly shows an appetite for these conversations, and we at Sustain267 will continue to have them and share them with you. Thank you to our partners, the British High Commission, for making this possible, the panelists Tremayne Stanton-Kennedy, Baitshepi Babusi Hill, and Dr. David Lesolle for joining us and contributing to the conversation. And thank you to the audience of the webinar for their participation and to you for listening to this episode of the podcast. A huge thank you as well goes to the project assistant Amuchelani Willie and the sound engineer Malehuma Koti. We'll be hosting another session post COP26 looking at the outcomes of COP. We'll be hosting another session post COP26 looking at the outcomes and what those mean for Botswana. Please follow us on social media to keep posted on the details of that webinar. Remember, we are still in the middle of a pandemic and lives are still being lost. Wear a mask, sanitize, maintain social distance, and keep safe. My name is Babusi Sidze. I am the host of Sustain267. Take care.
Sustain267.